All right, well, thanks very much. As Dr. Greenwood told you, I do have stories, and they're never pre-planned. So in the course of this talk, you'll never know what you're going to get. Some of them sitting in the back of the room might attest to that. Basically the idea is I'd like to talk about the Tour de France or the Tour de Folly, depending on which way you look at it, and basically looking at a historical perspective between the development of the race and the things that happened in science that led up to the field of exercise physiology. And the short story is, even though the Tour started in 1903, there's not a marrying up of the exercise sciences with sport until the early 1960s, maybe the late 1950s. So, as any good tour should start, you start with a prologue. Prologue is usually a shorter event that goes, is sort of the opening round or the opening salvo for the race. But the prologue to the history of the Tour de France is that you have to realize that in the 1890s or the late 1800s, cycling was arguably the most visible sport in the world. Some might take discuss the idea that boxing was right up there with it, but no matter which way you look at it, that was sort of a pinnacle for the sport's visibility. And before the Tour even started, one of the most famous types of races are something called six-day events. So you get a group of cyclists come in and they hang out on an indoor track. That's probably Madison Square Garden, or at least the old Madison Square Garden. And they race for 6 days, and whoever covers the most distance wins. So it's filled. The crowd is filled throughout the venue. And you have to remember that in the 1890s, there's no smoking regulation. So everybody sitting in the audience is actually smoking while the cyclists are actually doing their thing. This is why I wanted the... So one of the things that many don't realize is, if you look at the color barrier in sport, many people will think of names like Jack Johnson, who was a boxer, and that was like in roughly around 1905, breaking the color barrier for professional sport and black athletes. Some will likely choose Jackie Robinson, who didn't do it until 1945. Most people don't know is that the first black athlete to break the color barrier was a guy named Major Taylor. Major Taylor was the son of slaves that had left the South and moved to Indianapolis. And he took up, the short story is he took up track cycling. And when he track cycled in the United States, he was vilified. He was made to sleep in blacks only room, blacks only bathrooms, that sort of thing. But he became a world champion. And so whenever he left the country, he was treated like royalty. Whenever he was in the country, he was sort of vilified for being black. And when he rose to the top, he made a financial, so he started as the son of slaves. But when he rose to the top, he made the financial equivalent of Michael Jordan when Michael Jordan was in his heyday. So he went from rags to riches, then through a series of bad investments, lost everything, and died in total poverty. So here's a few highlights. World champion 10 years before Jack Johnson, 45 years before Jackie Robinson, etc. So how did the Tour de France get started? Here's sort of the media gets to control everything. An individual named Henri de Grange was he worked for a newspaper in France, and he was a world record holder in 1983. You never see the typos until the slide shows up, and then it just jumps right at you. Although I've given this 3 times and nobody else has caught it until now. So, yep. Anyway, so he decided it would be a good idea to let's have a cycling event, invite cyclists from all over the world. It'd be a great publicity thing. We'll sell tons of newspapers, and we'll have these cyclists cycle around the perimeter of France. So this is basically the first race. It's 7 stages. It's roughly 2,900 kilometers, give or take. And each kilometer is roughly 400 kilometers in length. In fact, it was so lengthy that, unlike today's events where you do your stage and then you sleep overnight and then you go to the next stage, sometimes this took 2 to 3 days of rest before they could go on and do the next stage. So the first one, again, 2,400 kilometers, roughly 1,500 miles. And it's gone through different changes in length. So you can see that it's run continuously through today with 2 breaks. The 2 breaks were World War I and World War II because Europe was a little busy with fighting those wars. But the longest event was 5,745 kilometers in length, and that one took place. That was 17 stages in length. So the first winner, or the first race, or the first several years, you're looking at roughly around, 2,400 to 3,700 kilometers on unpaved roads. There's no such thing as a team, so you had to. Today, when you race, you followed around by an entourage of buses and that sort of thing, and people drive up to you and you say, "Oh, you look hungry, have some food," or "Here, you look thirsty, drink some fluids." But there were no teams, so you had to fend for yourself. Of the people who started, 33% finished, and a mean speed of about 27 kilometers per hour. And just for grins, the bikes that they rode were 20 kilograms, roughly 50 pounds, and had one gear. So self-sufficiency, if you had a flat, you had to fix your own. And this is a picture of a race marshal making sure that nobody helps this rider in his endeavors. In fact, the story of Eugene Christoph goes is that he was riding down sort of a mountainous path, or it probably was a path, or a mountainous road, and he cracked the frame on his bike. So he had to carry his bike to a local farmer who also had an anvil and blacksmith materials. And so you can see him here. This is a drawing. In the background, you see the race officials going, "You will receive no help." So you have to stoke the billows, swing the hammer, and hold the frame, which requires 3 hands. So at one point, he actually asked the farmer's son if he would stoke the billows while he hammered and made the repairs, and was subsequently penalized in time for the event. So when you're looking at sport, all the biggies are present. You have to have nutrition, you have to have hydration. We'll probably touch on doping a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit of equipment. So again, self-sufficiency, you put your bike at a local restaurant and you find your own meals. From a physiology standpoint, this is sort of the first, if you're going to look for an exercise physiology connection, this is arguably one of the first connections where looking that if you, for a prolonged period of time, if you ingested glucose, that would actually raise blood glucose concentrations in the blood, but there's no connection at this point in time between glucose or carbohydrate and performance. So what is the caloric requirement of the Tour de France? So the modern tour is 21 stages. You have 2 rest days in the middle, roughly on day 11, and then another day. And it'll range between 6,000 and 9,000 plus calories per day to get through this event. So what does that look like in terms of food? So let's use a common currency, a common food denominator, okay, to see how many calories that is. So let's look at a training day. We'll look at cheeseburgers. Everybody knows a cheeseburger. All right, so typical training day. You get up in the morning and you have breakfast, which is the equivalent of 2 cheeseburgers. Then you kind of do your morning routine, shower and sort yourself out. Then you have a snack, which is the equivalent of another cheeseburger. Then you go for your training ride and you come back and you have lunch and you have to replenish your calories. And then an afternoon snack, then dinner, then another snack, then to bed. Get up, repeat the next day. However, when you get to the tour, or when you're in the tour, you don't get to eat as regularly as this, so you have to eat somewhat on the road. So this is what it looks like. You get up for breakfast and you have 3 cheeseburgers worth of food. All right, you start the race around 10. At the beginning of the race, you'll ingest some food because it takes a while for food to get from your mouth and through your gut and into the bloodstream to provide you with energy, so you have to eat early. All right, so during the race, you'll eat maybe 1 or 2 because how many cyclists in the room? How many people really like to eat a lot of food if you're riding like 150 kilometers? It's not, it's like you just eat enough to get by. And personally, I think, how many people think the last thing they want to see is when they come back from a big training ride is like a power bar or something like that? I'd rather see a cheeseburger myself. So anyway, so you have this massive caloric deficit. And so you have to come back, and at dinner you have to make up for it. So it's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 cheeseburgers worth of caloric replenishment. And then before bed you have a little snack, and then you get up the next day and you go race again. All right, so in its healthy day, in today's healthy age, people will be somewhat paralyzed by the idea that people would eat cheeseburgers. I'll look around the room and in a talk like this, and people go, oh, cheeseburgers, like I committed this mortal sin. So just to set the record straight, the cheeseburgers that we're talking about here were whole wheat and gluten-free, 90% fat-free, made from free-range cattle, eating fortified flax feed to raise the DHA levels in their meat. All right, the cheese produced from milk is the same thing. Lettuce and tomato are all calorically grown, and carbohydrate and proteins are delivered in a 3-to-1 to 4-to-1 ratio. However, in the early days, not knowing these particular things, they ate what they got. And so during one event in 1936, this writer remarked that he had never eaten so much food in his life, because you have to realize that during World War I and during World War II, you're also dealing at a time where you've had a war and now people are trying to economically recover. So food is somewhat scarce, and the supply chain for food is somewhat scarce. And so again, this is the birth of the protein diet. 3 whole chickens at dinner the night before this particular event. Hydration is another one. You had to find it. In the early days, you had to find your own hydration. Nobody brought you a bottle and said, drink this. Okay, so this is just drinking out of a local fountain in a local town. Now, I should add, in the early days, there's a couple of things that go on. In the early days, it was just French riders. And so you would go through various parts of France, and you would have a local favorite, and then you had the rest of the riders. So when the local favorite came through, everybody cheered, cleared the path. And then when the other riders came through, it wasn't uncommon to throw nails and glass into the road in the effort to flatten their tires so their local favorite could gain an advantage. Okay? So why is hydration important? Well, what we do know with exercise physiology now is that if you lose a certain percentage of body weight from dehydration, depending on, you can see it roughly at about even just 1% of your body weight, performance starts to decline from 100% to maybe 95%, 3%, 4%, 5%. So now you're down functioning. If you lose 5% of your body weight due to dehydration, you're now operating at a roughly 75 to 80% of your maximum performance. So you may recall that one hot day when Lance Armstrong was purported to have lost 5% of his body weight due to dehydration. I didn't buy it, and the reason I don't buy it is because you don't win the tour, asterisk, and operate at 75% of your maximum capacity. All right, so what does hydration look like? Again, we'll look at a common currency. During the race, it's a good idea to try and consume, or at least throughout the day's event, 6 to 7 liters. You guys are all smiling in the back because you know it's coming next. So that's what this looks like. In the course of a day's event, you need to drink a fair amount of fluid. And the beer analogy is not really so horrible, because in the early days it wasn't uncommon to pick up bottles of wine along the way and drink bottles of wine. Although too much hydration does have its disadvantages, there is a certain rule of the peloton that if riders need to pee, everybody stops, pees together, gets back on their bike, and goes on their way. All right, perils. Here's a rider that, again, early days, there's no guardrails on the side of the road, and you're going up along these thin roads. This rider went off the edge of the cliff, and people on the side, the only way they got him back up, they didn't have a rope, so they took tire inner tubes and interlinked them long enough to get down and then help him climb back up. However, in the modern day, we do know that sprinting is not for the weak or the meek. It's an all-out event, and people crash on mountains, they crash on sprints, but if how many people have been in a relatively high-speed crash? It depends on how you define high speed. Falling off your bike and hitting the pavement, even if it's, when you're new to cycling, you first learn how to use cleated shoes and you roll up to a stop sign, you don't know how to get out and you tip over and fall down, even that hurts. So you can imagine doing it at 25 or 35 miles per hour. All right, so if you get hurt during cycling, you're at a disadvantage the next day, and so things like, and yeah, it's a bloody mess. So the idea is that you also have to, nutrition or recovery becomes somewhat mindful in the training regimen, but again, in the early days it was not, because nobody knew really how to do it. Anyway, so all the cyclists in the room, if you're in a crash, what's the first question you ask when you fall off your bike and somebody comes over and says, "Are you okay?" That's it. See, that's how you know when you become a real cyclist and you fall off and you crash, and the first question you ask, "Is my bike okay?" So cyclists will get, they're hard-nosed. They will get back on the bike and keep riding. Not so much like other sports. So we'll move from that nutrition into ergogenic aids. We'll put that in quote because It's a concept. Ergogenic aid is any aid that makes you improve performance. We won't worry about legalities or anything like that at this particular point in time. But you'll notice here, you haven't missed it. Once upon a time, at the start of a race, people would ride together and smoke cigarettes because they felt that smoking cigarettes would open your lungs to allow you to breathe easier during the course of the race. Okay. It wasn't until 1966 the first anti-doping controls came into a stricter enforcement. But this is the quote of Jacques Anquetil, who won the Tour de France 5 times when they first starting to look at the doping issue in 1957, and basically wanted to be left in peace. He thought hydration should be done with champagne and not water, so he was sort of one of those spirited French guys. Anyway, and so does anyone really think that we can race to Paris on mineral waters alone? And the quote of the day is, sports diets, because they had started to come a little bit into vogue in exploration, sports diets are an evil invention. All right. So in the early races, from 1903 to the 1940s, doping is actually somewhat acceptable. So there's a variety of means that, well, I'll call it doping. We'll call it ergogenic aids because it wasn't illegal. So it came in a variety of forms. And so this particular individual, after one race, utters these, and when they started talking about getting rid of doping or any kind of doping, it says, I can't take so much pain anymore. We would take any drug to complete the race. And every night we danced the St. Vitus Dance instead of sleeping. So the St. Vitus Dance is a neurological disorder that causes you to spontaneously twitch. So if you take enough amphetamines, you will probably spontaneously twitch as well. So yeah, it was just basically a lot of amphetamine and stimulant overdoses. But here were the ergogenic aids of the day. Amphetamines, wine, and they were taken alone or in combination. Amphetamines, wine and strychnine, ether-soaked handkerchiefs, that's sort of novel. Chloroform rubbed into your gums, cocaine, heroin, caffeine, nitroglycerin. All right. So what happened keep in mind this is all self-medicated. They're sort of figuring out their own sort of thing. So some of the early things and why race organizers started to think that, remember, it was all started to sell newspapers. And so if you're trying to sell newspapers, it really doesn't look good if a cyclist overdoses and gets into sort of a drastic condition. So it was in 1955 that a particular rider, 10 kilometers from one of the premier mountain stages, climbed to a summit of Mount Ventoux, collapses, falls off his bike, and one foot is in the pedal, the other foot comes out, and it's still going through the pedaling motion as he's lying there on the road. In 1960, Roger Riviere overshoots a turn, and basically the reason going down a descent and breaking his back and leaving him paralyzed. And he had so many opioids in his system, he couldn't figure out how to squeeze the brakes. Probably the most famous or infamous, depending on which way you look at it, is a fellow named Tommy Simpson, who's climbing up Mount Ventoux. Mount Ventoux, they call it going to the moon, because you leave this beautiful plush valley, and then you climb to the top of this barren, treeless, vegetationless peak. So it's 40 degrees centigrade for the metrically impaired, roughly 105 degrees. 1,700 meters of altitude. His cocktail is a mixture of amphetamines, alcohol, and coffee. And by the time he's going up the race, he doesn't make it to the top. He falls off the bike, suffering from severe dehydration and diarrhea, which he actually rode with. Greg LeMond, who's also not a five-time winner, but a winner of the Tour de France, an American, the only legitimate American that still held on to his title. Riders just keep going in all sorts of conditions. But so he falls off his bike. He subsequently dies on the race course. But the first words that when he sort of became lucid or started to get some consciousness back was, "Put me back on the bike." So is the bike okay? Put me back on the bike. Don't be a soccer player. I can make fun of soccer players because I used to play soccer professionally, so it's right in my it's no problem with me. Anyway, so here's a list of doping is certainly something that's prevalent today. Cycling is sort of the bad boy of sport, but let's not be naive. Let's be honest. If you look at professional sports across the globe, across the discipline, doping is prevalent, and this will probably hurt your feelings too. It's also prevalent in the NCAA, and even cases have been found that in high school athletes being tested positive for doping in a variety of different sports. So it's not just a cycling thing, it's just that cycling is particularly good at making headlines out of it. But here's a list of all the individuals that either competed in the Tour de France and were never found, never. So it's not that they were, never means they never had a positive test. Doesn't mean they never doped. Because Mr. Armstrong said, I've never had a positive test. He never said, I don't dope. I've never had a positive test. Anyway, so the interesting thing here is that when you're looking at Lance Armstrong's victories, remember that he got stripped of his victory, so even though he won 7 times, technically he didn't win any. But usually what they do is give the winner the race victory to the next person. But for his particular races, 87% of the top 10 that they could have chosen from to give an award to were confirmed dopers. So they just didn't give it to anybody. So those 7 years go blank. So let's enter into science. Actually, science had its informal entry in around 1931 when somebody decided, hey, if you want to be a better rider, you need to go to altitude. And so this particular individual did these concentration camps at altitude. And they'd go up and they'd ride in the mountains in order to acclimatize to the high altitude conditions. And we probably all know that altitude training is somewhat synonymous with better sports performance. And so now there's a variety of aids to help you train at altitude while you live at sea level. So you can put this tent up in your bedroom, and it will send in, it will mix the air concentration, usually it's nitrogen, to simulate altitude while you're sleeping. So now you have to ask yourself the moral question, I'm not allowed to take illegal drugs, but if I don't live at altitude, is this really fair? And I don't have an answer for you, it's just something for you to think about. And so they come in a variety of shapes, sizes, and forms. You can have a tent, you can have them, people will come to your home and retrofit your home so it can be an altitude-based home. They have these mixtures where you actually wear a face mask and breathe in a mixture of different gases in order to simulate altitude. They are very pricey. And then you have this lovely little thing. Have you seen this in your local gym? Don't raise your hand. But if you have one, take it back and ask for your money back, because it's total crap. It doesn't work. The idea is that it restricts blood flow or airflow into your lungs, and it makes your lungs work harder in order to get the requisite amount of air. But your lungs are they're passive, okay? So a number of studies have come out and shown that these don't work. So if you see somebody in the gym wearing one of these with their workout, just be nice. In the early 1920s, we have what's something called the Harvard Fatigue Lab. How many exercise science students in this group? They're so timid to raise their hands. Like, I think I'm in exercise science. Anyway, do you know what the Harvard Fatigue? Do you know what the Harvard Fatigue Lab is? Have you ever heard of it? We're going to have to talk about curriculum after this. Yeah. Anyway, so the idea is that during the Harvard Fatigue Lab was formed for 2 basic reasons. First of all, it was run under the Harvard Business School. It wasn't run under a scientific platform. And what they were really looking at is they wanted to look at fatigue factors or performance factors related to occupation and related to industry. Remember, in 1927 and 1947, you have 2 world wars. So you have a lot of munitions that need to be built. What causes fatigue, what causes mistakes, that sort of thing. And this is why, sort of the impetus of why these sorts of labs started to open up. They also started to look at wartime research, because you have to feed your soldiers. It's not like they can just go to the local food vendor and buy some and go off back to fighting. Okay. All right, so this is sort of a blueprint of an early ergometer. All right. So basically it's like you'd walk in reverse, be tethered in, walk with the weight. To cause your resistance. And again, this is another idea. So these big, I used to have, my very first treadmill, I swear, when I was an undergraduate, was about this big. It was one of those, I think Quentin made it. It was just this giant treadmill, and it was like it had a sandpaperish type thing. It was awesome. It was sat about this high off the ground, but you could like ride a bike on it. It was fantastic. but yeah. All right. Also during that time is the concept of VO2 max. Okay, exercise science people, you have heard of VO2 max, even if you haven't heard of the Harvard fatigue max. So the idea is that Archibald Vivian, or A.V. Hill, at Cambridge University basically looked at oxygen consumption with increasing workloads, and the idea is that when you got to maximal oxygen uptake, there was a leveling off or plateauing of oxygen uptake. You basically could not take up anymore. And this is an interesting that if you trace that forward, periodically this debate resurfaces because is there a plateau, is there not? And some people argue that there isn't, some people will argue that there is. Okay. Exercise testing takes on a new look. In the early 1900s, in the laboratory of Atwater and Benedict. Does this bike look familiar to any cyclists in the community? Does this look like the very first Velotron ever made? Okay. Yep. So you're basically riding a bike against resistance, and you're collecting oxygen and analyzing it through here. It was also during this time that the very first portable heart rate monitor was developed. That's this thing here.
Oh,
that thing on his back. That's the portable heart rate monitor. 87 pounds. Anyway. Okay. Again, during the 1927 to 1939, you do see a certain amount of globalization. Globalization means instead of being an all-French event, teams are allowed to show up. The first Australian shows up in 1928, not 928. The individual team time trial is introduced. For those of you not familiar with cycling, that's the event where all the riders take off together and they all get in a line and they draft off one another and they just sort of rotate out through the course of it. So that starts in 1935. And this is when a time period when derailleurs show up. So remember at the beginning I said you only had one gear? So you only had one gear. So if you were going on the flat or downhill or uphill, you only had the one gear. So at one time, they worked around this by making a two-gear system. You would have a smaller gear for riding on the flat. Then you would have a bigger gear to climb the mountains. And a favorite trick of cyclists was if you had this two-gear system, but basically it wasn't on a derailleur where you could just move the chain. What you had to do is you had to stop your bike, take your wheel off, flip the tire around, and put it back in and get it all sorted back out again. So before, with this two-cog system, what some riders would do is they'd race ahead and go up around the bend. And then when the next riders would come, if they didn't know what was up ahead of them, because there wasn't a lot of reconnaissance before, they didn't go out and ride the course before, it was all sort of new. They sort of faked like they were putting on their mountain gear, and so the other cyclist would come to a screaming stop and he'd change his tire. But the first rider knew that there wasn't a mountain because it was local geographic area. So he went on down the road, and the bigger gear, the second rider was sort of just spinning his wheels. Bad pun. Anyway, I don't have the film clip for this anymore, or I do someplace, but here's an idea. So in the 1960s, you have this birth of modern physiology, and this has driven not only people in America, but the Scandinavian countries have a huge influence on the development of exercise physiology. So good physiologist wants to know what's going on from where you first inhale to exhalation, all the things in between, and what drives blood around the system. So this was a series not too long ago, probably in the last 15 years, that they did in Scandinavia. And you're looking at a cross-country skier. This guy has arterial and venous catheters in his arms, in his legs, and his neck. Carotid arteries, carotid vein. Because they want to see what's happening with gas exchange or whatever they put in. And so they wanted to also see, in this particular experiment, what happens when you just do the skiing action, what happens when you add the poling action, what happens when you do both together. And they basically find that when you do both together, when you put legs and arms together, that you actually get a drop-off in what's called cardiac output, because your body has to fight for where is the blood actually going to go. But to watch this take place, that they're taking samples as the guy's doing the exercise as well as the oxygen consumption. And then when it's all said and done, they just lay him down on a table and start plucking away, doing biopsies, which is sort of looks like this. And some of these characters in the back actually do biopsies as well. characters is an affectionate term for fantastic doctoral students. Right. Will this play or will it not? I don't think it will. So one of the things, again, is that looking at energy output over the course of a race is the idea of efficiency. Why spend more energy than you need to? So than one needs to during the course of a race, because if you're going to do this for 21 days, you want to have something in the tank or something in reserve. You don't want to spend more energy than you have to. And some of the studies that came out of our group, I work with a team called Benesto. Benesto they had the rider Miguel Indurain. Miguel Indurain was a 5-time winner. He won 5 times in a row. And we've, I don't know, probably close to a dozen papers that have come out. It's the only team that's ever collected data on riders. So this is a little bit of the data that we collected on those particular riders. Because it's a professional sport, nobody wants to give up a secret. But Benesto, they made it part of their contract that they had to participate in these particular studies. And a lot of these studies are unless it's the off season, if it's races that took place during the event, it's observational. You just collect data. It's not like you're going to tell cyclists, you pedal really fast and you pedal really slow, or you eat this and you eat that, and they're to race, and that's their job. But one of the things we looked at efficiency at higher power outputs at 60 RPMs versus 100 RPMs, or how fast do you turn the pedals. And we basically found that if you pedal at 60 RPMs at a high level, a power output, you're 22% less efficient, which I'll show you in a second, than pedaling at something like 100 RPMs. And part of this is intuitive, but if you go to a variety of cycling events, and I'll throw triathlons into the mix, there's a certain genre of cyclists that think the bigger the gear and the slower your pedal cadence, it basically means that you're going to have higher outputs. And it probably, at the end of the day, it really boils down to the individual rider. But basically here, it's not only lower efficiency, but you get a higher recruitment of type 2 muscle fibers. And the type 2 muscle fibers are the glycolytic fibers, are those that use muscle glycogen. So they fatigue a lot quicker. Whereas at 100 RPMs, your efficiency is 24% higher, or is roughly around 24%. You have a lower fiber recruitment, concentrating more on the type 1 muscle fibers, which are the oxidative fibers that help you with endurance type activities. So what did we see? Looked at oxygen consumption at 60 RPMs, 80 RPMs, and 100 RPMs in professional cyclists. And yes, there's a lot of variance, but you can see there's definitely a trend for being more efficient, lower VO2 for a given workload at the higher pedal cadences. And if we look at a variety of different things, you can see for lactic acid production, which is in the upper left-hand corner, all right, EMG activity, which is the top and to the right. Pedaling cadence is pH levels, which is synonymous with lactic acid. And again, looking at EMG activity and the gluteus maximus. So top one's vastus lateralis, the muscle on the outside of your thigh. This one's vastus, or gluteus maximus, or your glutes. So why would efficiency really matter? Well, if you're on a flat stage, probably not as much as you would think, but when you get to mountain stages, efficient becomes paramount. Basically, more times than not, the Tour de France or any of the 3-week stage races, the Vuelta a España or the Giro d'Italia, are won or lost in the mountains. If you're not good in the mountains, you better be really, really good other places. I don't think sprinters do very well. In fact, I'm not sure. I have to look up and see when sprinting was actually introduced, because I'd be willing to bet it was a combination of publicity. Looks really cool. Sprinting's really, but also, if you're competing in the Tour de France and your job is to help support a contending rider, what's the point? They're probably not paying you enough, and you're not going to get your glory opportunities. So I think that's probably somewhat of the decision of putting sprinting into the event. It's a crowd favorite, and it keeps riders engaged all the way to the end that are probably going to serve a supporting role later on. But the first mountain stage is 1906. It's 9 kilometers in length, 6.3% grade. It was ridden at roughly 20 kilometers per hour. And to show you that, remember, unpaved roads, 50 kilogram bicycles, and the balloon tires, not the skinny racing tires. And so with a few calculations, this came out to roughly about 365 watts of power output, which is pretty good. In contrast, And here's where the pedal cadence come in efficiency. You have Lance Armstrong and the Alpe d'Huez, 14 kilometers, 8% grade, 100 RPMs. And after 5 hours of warm-up to get to the bottom of the mountain to climb, he manages to climb at 475 watts. Is there a test on this?
Could be. That's your last slide, isn't it?
Yeah, no. How am I on time?
You are dealing with about 15 more minutes. Some questions.
That's an eternity. I can do this. So one of the things that we looked at in some of the races is looking after 21 stages. We wanted to see how much stress does it really put on your system. And we found that in some of the riders that looking at heart rate, maximum heart rate during the event, maximum achieved, it would start off 182, 184, which is probably reasonable for somebody in their 20s. All right, by the end of the race, nobody's exceeding 176, 177, 178. So there was this idea that we hypothesized that there's a certain degree of sympathetic system exhaustion. So how do you go about looking at that things? One of the things you can look at hormones. Cortisol drops off really badly during the race. But the group that I was working with came up with a model called TRIMPS. And TRIMPS is, I forgot what the acronym is, but it's basically measuring levels of exertion, training impulses. That's what it is, training impulses. How much energy are you expending during a race, and how do you actually measure that? Because it's pretty inconvenient to be driving along in a team car and then take a lactate measurement for somebody who's in the middle of a race, and you're certainly not going to pull off to the side of the road and do biopsies. So you have to do it by heart rate. So here's how it was taken on. Heart rate, and the higher your power output, heart rate increases with power out in a linear fashion. All right, so the first thing that was done is that if you take respiratory measurements, you look at something called ventilatory threshold. Ventilatory threshold is the relationship between oxygen consumption, carbon dioxide production. Basically, they occur together until you reach a certain level of work, and then you'll produce more carbon dioxide than oxygen consumed. So there's a deflection point. That's called ventilatory threshold. Sometimes it's called VT1, ventilatory threshold point 1. That occurs in professional cyclists someplace around 60 to 70% of VO2 max. If you go up a little bit higher, you have a second break point, and this is called respiratory compensation, although you will see it in the literature as ventilatory threshold number 2. So what happens? Break this down into there's 3 basic sections. 1, clever, 2, 3. Where at the bottom, it's a very low intensity, and people are, the majority of their fuel is coming from fat. In the middle, between VT1 and respiratory compensation, it's a mix of carbohydrate or glycogen and fat. And when you get to level 3, now you're in the red zone. Now you're burning almost exclusively muscle glycogen in order to do the work task. And so the way this works is that for every minute that during an event that you're in zone 1, you multiply by that 1. So if it's 120 minutes, you get 120 points. Okay. Every minute you're in zone 2, it's multiplied by 2. It's really clever. And every minute in zone 3, you get 3 TRIMPs. So 1, 2, or 3. So we started looking at this, related to this, because we wanted to look at the ideas that race winners or people who are going to be competitive need to sort of look at this fatal cycle of which can be compounded by poor nutrition but recuperation or rest and the amount of physical exertion that one is looking at. So what do TRIMPs mean? Oh, Trumps. Sorry. What's a total trump? Let's not go there. So if you compete in one of the Grand Tours and you accumulate less than 5,000, you've basically been on vacation. It's not a lot of effort during the course of a 21-day race. Total TRIMPs of over 7,000 means you worked your tail off for somebody or for yourself. Okay, and then the highest recorded TRIMPs that we have in our particular database is 7,500. So is there an upper limit? I'm not sure. It's probably a little bit different today. Nobody's carrying on this line of research, so I couldn't really tell you what it is. So what have we learned from racing? Well, in racing you have domestiques. They're the sort of the servants for a designated race leader. Usually there's 2 to 3 people that are sort of designated from a team to compete for the overall grand prize, and everybody helps that person get to the end in the fastest way possible. So the domestiques, they protect the race leader as much as possible. So what did we look at? We looked at something called heart rate variability. Has that crossed your paths at all? Looking at autonomic balance in racers. So we looked at designated race leaders and domestiques. So in the first 10 days of racing, we saw that if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you see that the domestiques basically had very higher is better. So these little dots, the higher up, the better. And with exhaustion, we theorized that these numbers would come down. So RMSSD is basically looking at parasympathetic nervous activity for the heart. But they're based, so the domestique, even though they're still relatively high, is around 3,000, and the designated leader who ended up winning stage 3 of the race is roughly around 2,350. So about half, okay, the amount of total work. They've been well protected up to this point. But nobody cares about the first 10 days. I mean, as long as you don't crash and you're still in the event, you're still a contender. And so we drew a regression line through this, and if you know anything about statistics, a correlation of R squared of 0.01 and change, that's dead flat. There's no relationship between the two things. So day 11, day 10 is the rest day. So then you go into the next stage of racing. And what we find now is that, let's look here. So the designated leader, if you read across from here and across, they're roughly 46 to 47. This particular designate for parasympathetic activity. And when you get to the end of the race, they're still up around 55. You can almost argue that they're actually getting a little bit better. But you look at the domestique, and now they're all the way down to 12 or 13. This person has done a lot of work, all right? And so in the second, days 11 to 17, roughly 2,200. This person's around 2,350. So somebody asked, well, why the yellow line? Okay, never mind. I'll do it. Why the yellow line? If you look at the New York Heart Association guidelines for looking at people with congestive heart failure, this around 28 to 30, somebody walks in the door with a heart problem and their parasympathetic activity is down around 28, there's probably a pretty good chance they have congestive heart failure. So that's how these riders have pushed themselves so hard that they've lowered their level to that much. Now, before everybody panics, they're athletes. They'll recover. They get better. It's temporary. Here's another thing that I don't know, I kind of thought it was really interesting because I basically drove the entire study. We looked at TRIMPs, and this was, I can't remember how many riders that we looked at, but it was in the hundreds. And we looked at TRIMPs. How much time did people spend in zone 1, zone 2, and zone 3 if you were a domestique or a designated contender? And so you have the prologue or the short time trials, and you can see that everybody is in the red zone because it's short. I think the short time trials are less than 10, 11, 12 kilometers, sometimes as low as 6. So it's pretty much jump on your bike and haul ass and get across the finish line as much fast as possible. Uphill time trials. Contenders, again, you make or break your event in the mountains, so they'll work a bit harder. There's more time in the red. Individual time trials, same sort of pattern, but support riders are sort of using this as a recovery. Yeah, they're there to compete in the event. They have to complete it not to go on to the next stage. They can't just sit down and say, I'm not racing today. But again, a second place, you can make or break your tour or your grand tour successes in individual time trials. Here's what I was really interested in. Remember we talked about the individual team time trial where you get people and you draft and you would think, I would have thought initially, I hypothesized that contending riders would have resembled this. They would have been protected during the individual team time trial. But we basically found that if you're a contending rider, when you get to the front to take your pull, you work much harder than your support riders do. The contending riders are the guys that really drive the individual time trial through to success or not. A little bit about equipment. 1947, this is the introduction of the first helmet. You can see it was rubber straps strapped together, and affectionately they called the guy Rubberhead. All right, but one of the things that was that's interesting to look at is there's always this contention of how much money should I spend on my bike? Because surely a $2,000 bicycle is not going to perform as well as like a 6,000 customized time trial. So let's look at a couple of things. Let's look at novice riders in blue. Intermediate riders or trained riders in, well, it's purple here, but it's pink there, so let's just call it pink. and then you have professional riders. Well, so if you look at body mass, if you take a 10 kilogram bike, roughly 20-pound bike, bike weight in a 40 kilometer time trial, if you're a novice rider, it will be like a 13-second difference versus a 7 kilogram bike. Okay? And if you're an intermediate rider, 7 seconds. If you're an elite rider, 5 seconds. So bike weight has a little bit of play. Now let's look at body mass. So you take that same 3 kilogram difference and you apply it to your body weight, independent of the frame. You'll go 25 seconds faster if you're a novice rider, 21 seconds faster if you're an intermediate rider, 19 seconds faster if you're an elite rider. Does anybody have a guess as to why? If you're riding, what causes resistance when you're riding forward? Basically, how much wind hits you in the front. So if you have this much to hit, you have a lot more drag coefficient. If you're narrower, you have about that much. So it's 19 seconds for body weight, 5 seconds for bike weight. But how many people will like lose 5 pounds versus spend $6,000 or $7,000 on a really cool time trial bike? It's just a thought, not judging. What if you throw them all together? Again, aerodynamics also plays. Aerodynamics on a novice rider, good aerodynamics will be roughly 1.8 minutes versus an elite rider 1.3 in a 40 kilometer time trial. Frame and optimized body position. So if you have the really cool frame and you're optimized for your body position, you're looking at 4 minutes to 3 minutes, depending on what level you're at. And then wheels will make about a minute's worth of difference. So, probably the most famous example of this is when Greg LeMond was something, I can't remember the distance. It was a very short distance in a time trial, and he was going up against Laurent Fignon, who was a very cocky, arrogant French guy. Wasn't afraid to speak his mind. Mon was something like 50 seconds back. It was the last event of the day. Basically, Fignon basically said, I'll be wearing the yellow jersey in Paris. I think he went public and basically said, I'll be wearing the yellow jersey in Paris. But because LeMond borrowed from triathletes, because triathletes were the only ones using aero bars at the time, had this optimized position, he actually ended up winning the race and defeating them. He came back, he knocked off that 50 seconds by having aerodynamic position. If you look at the red arrow, I think nobody has ever accounted for the ponytail, this aerodynamic drag in an event. And there you have it. Thanks for your time.
We do have a few minutes for any questions. I guess I'll start off. You said that no one's doing troops research anymore.
Correct.
What have they replaced that with?
None.
So yours was the standard, and
Right.
no one's been able to beat that.
Right. So so in the 90s there was a couple of groups looking at professional cyclists, but it's pretty much nobody's doing it now. So, although I think Team Sky has a very organized, probably one of the better organized racing teams, and they periodically report on what they're doing, but they're not formalizing it and putting it into any kind of research that I'm aware of, although I can't say that I haven't missed it all, some of it.
You did spend a little time talking about handlebar. What about the seat? Is there anything that you could share with that relative to options?
No, so the only thing with seat is basically a seat positioning, not width or weight of the seat. Yeah. So more and more riders are going to wind tunnels to optimize. When I talk about an optimized position, they go into a wind tunnel and they look at the most power output versus the resistance by moving the seat forward or backwards and trying to get at the idea of is there an optimal
So that's
seat
really
position?
An individual option.
Yeah. So you'd have to look at EMG activity and overall power output, that sort of thing.
So other than falling off your bike and getting injured, what are some of the more common injuries that you see with cyclists?
Other than exhaustion?
Is that an injury?
I don't know.
You said earlier they will recover from
Limitation.
that. So, right?
What's that? Well, so
Anything with wrists, anything with...
not that I'm aware of. Yeah. I mean, obviously, if you crash, there's a whole litany of
Other than falling off your
right.
bike.
Yeah. I mean, and I think there are things like there are overuse injuries, and there are indirect ones for, For instance, Tyler Hamilton fell in a crash going into the final stretch of a sprint event, and he broke his clavicle and continued racing. So the indirect one is that he was in such pain he ground down his molars by gritting his teeth so hard.
Oh, there's a question. Thank you, Sue.
I'd like to understand these trips a little bit better.
Me too. No.
So you developed this apparently working with a team,
Yes.
and did they use those data in some way to either predict performance or to shape training, or what was the utility of this in a practical
Right. So it wasn't used to predict performance, but it was used. So I don't know if you were here right at the beginning. So the team I worked with is a team. No, that's fine. You might have other things to do. It was a team called Benesto. Do you remember a team called Benesto? All right. So it was this team, and it was part of their contract that they go through these. They were tested twice a year, once during in season, one out of season, and they took mostly blood and some other. They didn't do any biopsy work, but the idea is that they wanted to get a handle on looking at these, at the total amount of work that they performed could come handy in the later race stages, and like in the third week, if somebody has, I don't know, I don't think they ever got to the point of targeting to say, we know that 7,000 is probably about as high as you're going to get before you kind of go over the cusp and are kind of not as useful to the team anymore. So they were tracking heart rate. So if you have a designated rider or two that's slated to win events, and you have other people that are there to just basically provide them a service to get them there, if you have a particular domestique that is working too hard, you might tell him for that day that he shouldn't be doing.
So you just found it a handy way to quantify.
Yeah, so they all,
volume of
yes. So they all wear heart rate monitors during the race. So you can look at heart rate and see, kind of get an
We're
idea.
doing a lot of that with athletic teams now on practices in the field. Go ahead.
Is that used by other teams currently? Like,
Nope,
is that still
not that I'm aware of. Well, I say that not that I'm aware of it. I mean, again, racing has become bigger and bigger. So they're not going to really come forward and say, this is what we're doing. They might talk around it. I'm sure they're all on some level monitoring heart rate, whether they're using this particular trim scheme or not. I don't know. But they're probably looking at heart rate, knowing the rider over a period of time that if heart rate drops off or is too high during a particular event relative to what they think. Because when you get into monitoring a race like this, you can take all the science in the world, but that only tells you so much. And then there's that whole coaching and looking after the team sort of thing. Okay, you first, you second, you third.
You got to end on that because there's another class coming in. So
They can wait.
some questions. Go ahead.
So how do you think power meters have affected the heart rate versus power meter debate?
I think power meters have. So I think power meters have taken cycling to a whole new level, because training with power I think is more effective. But you can use heart rate relative to power to know that if you're off on if you do a 40-kilometer time trial and I'll just pick arbitrary numbers, 250 watts, and your heart rate is 175, and then you get to a day and you do a 40-kilometer time trial at 250 watts, and your heart rate is 10 points higher, you might be looking at wanting to take a little bit more recovery.
You said that there was like a decrease in max heart rate throughout the race. Was there a corresponding decrease in resting heart rate?
It's a great question. I don't think there was. I think it stayed, but cyclists are pretty low. I think at one point, Lance Armstrong and I can't remember who, Miguel Indurain, when they did resting heart rates, they were down in the 30s. So.
Tori, you get the last question.
I was curious, based on research, is it just considered physically impossible to complete these races without doping? Because I know you said they've never been caught. Is it?
Yeah. So the answer is yes. They can complete these races. It's
not winning, I guess. Winning multiple years in a row, especially in Chris Broome's example, is a good example because he not only won the Tour this year, he won the World event as well.
Right, and so there's several riders that have done 2 Grand Tours in 1 year. But nobody's ever done 3. Although a lot of riders will race all 3 events in 1 year. Although they're probably serving a domestique role more than they are going for a win. So a lot of the riders that I mentioned here have won twice. Like Eddie Merckx is arguably the most accomplished cyclist. But Yeah, so yeah, it's definitely possible. It's just that it's sort of like the Olympics. You know, that it would be naive to say doping doesn't occur at the Olympics. And if you look at, there's a group out of Switzerland that's done some time projections for a number of events, and we basically hit the maximum for human performance. It's gonna, you know, it's gonna take off these sort of one-off sort of everything, the universe aligns and you jump 15 seconds. But it's now down to hundreds and tenths of a second. And if you look at the slope of the line, it basically plateaus. And so now you have to interject a whole bunch of things, because when you go to the Olympics, it's just like selling newspapers. You want people in the seats, and until people stop coming and sponsors start sponsoring, there's always going to be a doping presence, and it's not going to go away. So, so what fans have to come to, and sponsors have to come to terms with is, if you really, really, really went after doping and eliminated it, you're going to see slower times. And I don't know if sponsors or the viewing public wants to see slower times. It's like, oh, I remember 10 years ago when they did it. It's now they're just like, ah. Yeah. So it's convoluted.